thing down here.
Yeah, it's on this side, right there. Yeah. See, mine's down where yours is. I don't mind. I like it down low.
All right, since we're all here, let's start with a call the meeting to order and start with a pledge of allegiance, please. Can I ask you all to stand? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. If I could ask you to remain standing for a moment of silence, please keep in your thoughts the 19 firefighters from Arizona that died this past week. Thank you. All right. Next up, one of our favorite spots, Wednesday's Pet with former Selectman and First Selectman Sherry Stenick.
Okay, usually we have a dog or a cat. Today we have got a bird. Bird's name is Halliday. I have no idea if it's a male or a female. Guesstimate is that he or she is about 3 years old. They have a long life expectancy, anywhere between 5 and 20 years old, approximately. And this one probably was in a household because he's pretty friendly. So if you're missing a gray cockatiel with yellow around the jawline, then this might be your bird, and come to the animal control office at 211 One Rock Highway, also known as Richard White Way. What else do we need to tell them about this bird? $5 will get you this bird and a cage.
And a cage.
The cage comes too.
Not this cage necessarily, but a cage.
Okay. Now, is this the first bird we've had?
This is the first bird,
we
yes.
had, yeah.
And we're gonna rename this episode Sherry's Exotic Pets from here on in?
Yeah, Bill said he would bring the next bear he catches.
Oh, okay.
We're doing pretty well on dogs. We still have one that has not been taken, Lily. Daisy, excuse me, not Lily.
After 2 years, only one left. That's not bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Congratulations and thank you again.
Thank you.
Bill, thank you. All right. Next up, minutes to consider and act upon the minutes from regular meeting June 5th. Do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All right. Any edits or comments on these meetings?
Yes, my apologies. I actually thought I had sent those edits. I typed them up, and I believe they ended in my draft box. So if I may make a motion to postpone, because I have extensive edits and would like to, or motions, would like to get that to folks ahead of time. So I move to postpone to our next meeting on July 17th.
All right. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Any comments on the motion to postpone? Are we ready to vote?
Mm-hmm.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
That item is postponed. May I have a motion to accept the regular minutes from the regular meeting of June 19th?
So moved.
A second.
Second.
All right, any comments on these? I think I've got one. Jen, I'd gone over the wording with you. What was the wording we wanted added?
It was on behalf of the state delegation, State Representative Tony Long honors Jeff Key for the Connecticut Challenge for their outstanding work. And that was under the recognition portion at the beginning of the meeting.
Okay.
I make a motion that we add those words in as Jen recorded them.
Second.
All right. Any further discussion on that amendment? That amendment only? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. With apologies to Mr. Wong, who we're not having included him there the first time. So the minutes as amended are before us. Are there any further comments or questions? All right, we ready to vote?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So those minutes are done. All right. Next up, item 5, reappointments. To the Town Facilities Commission. Do you want to take these one at a time or as a group?
Group is fine.
Group is fine with me as well.
May I have a motion to accept Donald DiMartino, from a Republican from 84 Sunset Circle, Terry Leopold, unaffiliated from 146 Coleman Road, and Richard Special, Republican from 112 Homestead Lane.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All right, now these are reappointments. Any discussion on these? These will have to go to the RTM after this.
Mostly just grateful for those who serve. I see Mr. Special back there, and I'm grateful to the folks serving on the TFC.
I would just like to say thank you as well, and welcome back, and thanks for serving again.
I'd reiterate my colleagues' comments, and especially Mr. Special. Great job. I know you've taken on this and several other tasks to help out, including Sherman School, so thank you very much for your work on all those projects. Any comments from the public? All right, back to the board. Ready to vote?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Special. All right, next up, appointments. I'll take these one at a time. May I have a motion to appoint Dorothea Brennan, Republican from 1246 Fairfield Beach Road, for a term of 11/10 through 11/15 to the Fire Commission. This is replacing Richard Poplowski, who resigned recently.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All right, any comments from the board?
Quickly, I just want to thank Ms. Brenner for stepping up to serve on the Fire Commission. She has served our town well for many years on many different boards and commissions, including the Police Commission for many years, and did a wonderful job there. And I think I know the combination of her local volunteer skills, her commission experience, and her corporate skills will be a great value add to our Fire Commission going forward. So thank you for stepping up.
Kristen, any thoughts?
Yes, and I echo those sentiments of Selectman Kiley in terms of Ms. Brennan's experience, both in the town and also in her corporate life. And I do think that having a balance of perspectives and experience on the commission is important, as on all of our boards and commissions. And if I may just take a moment to just touch base about people coming forward. It's amazing to me, and was certainly when I was campaigning, how many talented folks we have in town. And certainly there are some boards and commissions that tend to be more popular and of interest to folks. And I know that there are many people who have expressed interest in serving, and I appreciate the efforts of the First Selectman's office to open up that process. And in fact, even today, there's a press release out for the Fairfield Ludlow Building Committee seeking members. So I just want to say that I think it's great the more we can open up the process and include some of the new folks who have not been involved in the past, and balance that with folks like Ms. Brennan who have experience as well, and hope that we continue to do so as we move forward, so that we have all members of our town represented on boards and commissions, both through our respective parties, political parties, as well as our unaffiliated voters. So with all that, thank you very much to Ms. Brennan, and for your willingness to serve in this capacity.
And I'd just like to add that Ms. Brennan has been very active in our community and served as a volunteer in a number of capacities, and we appreciate that experience. Importantly, she's long-serving and experienced executive on a corporate level, and I think that helps from a management standpoint in terms of what she's bringing to the table. But importantly, one of the interactions I've had with Ms. Brennan over the past 2 years has been her reaching out during the storms to provide some insight and input as to what's happening in the beach area, what might be happening, and she's been very involved in terms of making suggestions on what's good for the neighborhood and coming forward with solutions, not just problems, and that's always appreciated on this level. So I think we're all going to look forward to working with her on the Fire Commission moving forward. Any public comment? All right, back to the board. Are we ready to vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Congratulations, Ms. Brennan. Thank you. And thank you very much for stepping up. Next up, I have a motion to accept the nomination for Riverfield School Building Committee of William T. McDonald, Republican, 288 Adley Road.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
This position is vacant because Dorothy D'Amica resigned. Is Mr. McDonald here? Very good. Any comments from the board?
I'll begin. I want to thank Mr. McDonald for coming forward, and if I'm not mistaken, he is someone who had contacted the First Selectman's office and had expressed interest, and I think this is great. This is a wonderful way that we are able to gain from your experience, and I appreciate your willingness to jump in to a committee that's been involved and to get up to speed, and I understand that you've talked with Mr. Chairman Quinn, and I'm very grateful for your willingness to serve. Yes, and yes, so he just said, I'll repeat that so that everyone can hear, you're one of the first timers, and that's exactly what we're talking about. It's great to have that.
Any thoughts?
Just quickly, thank you, Mr. McDonald, for stepping up for this very important committee. We just spent a lot of time working through the Riverfield appropriation, which has now been approved, and you and your committee, led by Mr. Quinn, have a lot of great work to do, and good luck with that.
And again, I'll just reiterate, thank you for your help. I mean, Fairfield traditionally has been a town that's run by our volunteers, and it's a very crucial part of helping our town stay special, keep our community strong, and keep people involved in our towns. Mr. McDonald, thank you again for stepping up. Any comments from the public? Back to the board, are we ready to vote?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Congratulations, Mr. McDonald, and thank you again. All right, next up, to the Town Facilities. The next appointment was for the Town Facilities Commission. Mr. Dunny has withdrawn his name at this point, so we will not be voting on that. Next up, the Roger Ludlow High School Windows Building Committee charge. We can all turn towards that. Let's see, may I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
A second.
Second.
All right, this is a charge that's been before us in the past. We're looking at reviewing this, and given the changes to the Ludlow Buildings School project, Building Committee project, we want to make some changes to this. And if I might, let me suggest 3 areas to look at, and then
Sure.
we can pick up the discussion from there. When we look at the number of members, it says not less than 5. And not more than 11, and I think that's okay, even with the increased scope. I think it gives a chance to start with 5 and potentially expand from there as we need to. To the charge is also attached a rationale for the project, and I believe there is a Jen, is there a dollar amount here for the project?
Yes, it's right here. It's back, it's in the resolution. It should be behind. It's at the end.
Through? There we are. What I would suggest to the board is that we consider putting that, since that's an approved dollar amount, we consider adding that into the charge.
Okay.
Traditionally, we wouldn't do that because we'd be a year or more away from coming up with that dollar amount, but since we already have it, it seems appropriate that we at least consider doing that.
Okay.
And then I think we should add something to the project to address the expanded scope. When we first prepared this charge, it was just the windows. We now have the windows, the roof, and the renovation or expansion within the building.
I'm trying to find the appropriate spots for those, or have you already picked spots for the comments?
The scope, I think we can address up front, coordinates and supervise the necessary upgrading and renovation for the, I'd say, school expansion, windows, and roof replacement. At this school. So the first sentence read of Fairfield Ludlow High School Building Committee shall be established to plan, coordinate, and supervise the necessary upgrading and renovation of the school expansion, the windows, and the roof replacement.
Got it.
Do you want to include renovation in that language? Right after expansion?
School expansion and renovation. Okay, window replacement. Or window and roof replacement. So something like school expansion and renovation along with the window and roof replacement?
And I assume we're going to just knock the word windows out of this
The title?
title and the
yeah.
sentence.
I think we ought to, yes, wherever Fairfield Ludlow High School Windows Building Committee, I think we can just lose the word windows wherever that is, and just it's the Fairfield Ludlow High School Building Committee.
Agreed. So that's number one.
Do you want to start with that change and then move on to the others?
You want to do
or-
one at a time?
Neutral.
I would say if we can do them all at once, I don't have any other changes other than the addition of the amount.
Okay.
Which I think could just easily go right in that fourth paragraph after town and state regulations, simply adding a sentence. The committee shall maintain the budget of, or shall work within the budgeted amount of, or shall be
That's good.
limited to.
Shall work within the budgeted amount of. That's 11,630,000.
Okay.
Right.
The only thing we might want to add there as a reference, within the budgeted amount of $11,630,000 as per the attached bonding resolution, just so it links it back in, because there's a lot of detailed language in here that would fill in some blanks for the reader of that.
I like that. I think Mike is scribing here.
Okay.
I think
Anything
that's
else
good.
we should look at?
Just those three things, it looks like. Or is it
All right, so amendments before the board.
R?
One, to change the name of the committee, both in the title and any place else it's mentioned,
Yep.
to remove the word windows, so it is now the Fairfield Ludlow High School Building Committee. Two, that in the first sentence, it shall read as follows: the Fairfield Ludlow High School Building Committee shall be established to plan, coordinate, and supervise the necessary upgrading and renovation of the necessary school expansion and renovation, along with the window and roof replacement in the school. Does that sentence sound okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Shall be established, coordinate, and supervise the necessary school expansion and renovation along with the window and roof replacement in the school.
Yeah, I think that captures
Yep,
it.
yep.
And then
Uh-huh.
item 3, to insert as the third sentence in paragraph 4, the committee shall work within the budgeted amount of $11,630,000 as per the attached bonding resolution. Jen, do you have all of that? Okay, any other, is that good with the board?
Do you need a second for your motion?
Did you have a fourth thing, Mr. Tetro? Because I thought you said you had three, then
I
we
did.
added the name
Number,
change.
but number of people was
People.
fine.
But
We
you're-
start with
okay,
5.
okay.
Start with 5.
Got it.
I wouldn't want to start with less than 5, but I would like to be able, I think the committee needs to get started, and 5 would be a reasonable number to at least start.
Got
That
it.
doesn't keep us from adding more as we go.
Got it. Then I am good as well.
Okay, so can I have a motion for those amendments as proposed?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Okay, we've had a chance to discuss, okay to go to the public?
Yeah.
Any comments from the public on the amendments and the amendments only, please? All right, back to the board.
Just
Go ahead.
quick a question, though it's not exactly germane to the charge. You mentioned starting with 5. And I know that I'm doing commercials today, obviously. The Ludlow Building Committee, I noticed it asked for resumes and questionnaires to be returned by July 12th. Is there an expected or hoped-for timeline with that? And if it's not germane, I will respectfully defer.
Yeah, the building committee would ideally, if we can get 5 or more people, be addressed at this board at our next meeting in July. We would then, if approved by this board, we'd then talk to the RTM to see if we could get it on their July agenda. That would be up to the moderator if he chose to allow us to do that, but I think that would let the project get started in August, or at least the planning phases get started. The RTM is not meeting in August,
Right.
so that would push this off to the end of September if it wasn't done. Now, we can add people at that point, but at least some of the administrative items could be started prior to that. So that would be the thought.
Thank you.
So we meet on the 17th, is it?
No.
Yes.
Uh,
Oh, it's
14
six-
days from the 3rd, yes, you're right.
So we meet on the
17th.
17th, and that, the RTM probably has committees that week, and they probably meet, I'm not sure where the
They
fourth
meet
Monday
the-
falls, but there
they
should be
meet-
enough time to get this in, is what
The
you're saying.
consideration would be, it wouldn't get to committee, but the people
Right.
would be able to get to the RTM meeting itself and still have time to respond to members' questions,
Got it.
as often happens if an individual member can't make both committee meetings.
Right.
So it would just be, anybody who we approved would not be able to get to the committee meetings, so they pass from there. So
Beautiful.
I'm hoping the moderator will consider that, but it certainly would be up to him.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for answering that.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Back to us, are we ready to vote on the amendments?
Mhm.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So the charge is before us as amended. Any further discussion on that? All right. Any comments from the public on the charge as amended? All right, back to the board. Are we ready to vote?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Next up is the item from the town attorney, a report, here an update on the fire department staffing. Attorney Trembecki, thank you for coming back, and just to review, Attorney Trembecki was before this body with a report back, I believe, in March. It got here, his report came to us shortly before our meeting. We listened to a presentation, including a response or an add-on from the Attorney Saxel, who was representing the chief. We deferred to the Fire Commission to give them an opportunity to hear about this. And it was scheduled a month ago to come back before this board at a meeting that I couldn't attend, and I thank you both for delaying it till now or postponing it till now so that I could join in this discussion. And since we've had the presentation, I was going to open it up directly to questions unless there's some components of this you would like reviewed. First question I'd ask to Attorney Trembecki, just to kick that off, would be just update us on any changes or any discussion points from the Fire Commission, if you could.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. First Selectman. I did appear at the Fire Commission meeting, I want to say on May 9th of 2013, at the direction of this board, made a presentation, as did Attorney Saxel, on behalf of the chief, and he submitted a written report to your body back in April when we first met. He also submitted an updated document to the Fire Commission, which I have somewhere in my file, but I didn't bring with me. I didn't bring it to present with you today. I assume you have it. The presentation at the Fire Commission, I believe, resulted in two resolutions which were voted on. I don't have the exact wording of them. I presume that they're somewhere in the public record. One, to require that all promotions come before the Fire Commission, be they temporary or permanent promotions, if you will, and that in the course of the negotiation of the next town contract, that issues with regard to provisionals and acting, because there appears to be some discrepancy in the contract, be addressed as part of the collective bargaining process. Now, I don't know if you've had any input from them in that regard, and I presume that given the fact that the contract has expired at this point, that there's probably some negotiation and discussion going on as it relates to the contract. The only other thing that I would add is I noticed in your packet of materials that you've received a letter from the actuaries, Holcomb and Hooker, I want to say, with regard to what the actual cost of these promotions would be, and that was not part of my report. It was received, it looks like June 28th or something like that, directed to Mr. Mayor. But I didn't necessarily get involved in the arithmetic anyway. I sort of accepted what had been presented to me as a given. My role and investigation was really related to the contract, the legal documents and the legal statutes that govern the Fire Commission and the Fire Department, as well as to what actually happened. So the arithmetic I left to somebody else.
Just to add on for my fellow board members, following on Attorney Trembecki's comments, I had spoken with Commissioner Pompolowski back, I think as early as January, about two things that were needed. It looked like the commission wasn't aware of quite all of their responsibilities with respect to the contract, specifically that it was their charge within the contract to make sure that there was a promotion list when they identified potential vacancies coming up. And we spoke about two things. One, having an orientation for on the contracts and the roles of the commission within that, so they were definitely up to speed in that. And second, also an orientation on FOI rules, regulations to kind of help the commission with its business as part of that. Now, Commissioner Pompolowski recently resigned from the commission, so he's not available today. He had been at our prior meetings, and he'd been the primary source of contact. If I could, Chief, if I could ask the Chief just to ask one question up here. Has the Fire Commission had an orientation on contract language and their role in it as of today?
No, sir.
Okay, so that'll leave that back to me, I guess, for the board to follow up with them and see if we can get that in place. Thanks, Chief. I just wasn't sure if we closed on that yet.
No.
May I follow up?
Go ahead and start.
I thank you, Attorney
Sure.
Trembecki, and wanted to follow up in terms of that Fire Commission conversation, and thank you for just bringing forward those motions. And I did attend that meeting. One of the kind of questions I had leaving, and I was looking at my notes from that meeting, that the lateral transfers as well, and perhaps the chief might be able to help with this also, that the promotions would come before the commission. And I just wanted to see if there was any follow-up conversation about the process and understanding how that would happen, whether it be the promotion process or the lateral transfers. Was there any follow-up conversation with the commission? And again, this may be for the chief or the first selectman as well.
Nothing that I was involved in, certainly. I haven't had really any contact with anybody since our meeting with the Fire Commission. So perhaps the chief.
Chief, would you mind coming forward and addressing? Chief, if you could come to the podium so that...
The question again, Christian, just
So
to make sure we're clear.
Two pieces, I guess. What I heard Attorney Trembecki saying would be that all promotions would come before the Fire Commission.
Yes, ma'am.
And in reviewing my notes, and I did not actually go back and review the minutes again before today's meeting, but I also had notes about the lateral transfers and the commission's role in there. Was it your understanding at the commission meeting that the commission wanted all promotions or transfers to
Yes,
come
every
before
promotion I made, and through this, they were informed. Matter of fact, I met with the chairman at the coffee shop before the meeting, about 2 days before the meeting, made him aware of it, and he brought it up at the meeting. So I didn't make any of this without a secret to the commission. The Board of Fire Commissioners knew that the lateral transfers were taking place. And I have, record of that, or we can ask any of the commissioners.
So I think
Now, this was in, it wasn't in public session, which they also straightened that out, I understand. This stuff will be in public session now instead of executive session. I hope I answered that.
Well, I don't know that I am entirely clear, and I think I suppose this is more to the first selectman, just looking for what kind of process and follow-through. Obviously, there was a motion made, and my thought or understanding being there that the motion made was more of a change or a shift rather than kind of an affirmation of what the commission was doing already. And I may be misunderstanding that, but I think the question is, if there is going to be a shift in that process, what kind of follow-up conversation has happened? And I know we've had some transition within the commission as well, so I think that's more my question is, has there been any conversation and follow-up for any change, if there is going to be any change in process, which sounds unclear?
Yes, I was a little confused. Again, they were aware of it. I will say that, as standing up here as chief. They were all aware of it. It has been discussed in executive session. And it come out from there, and then they made a motion after that all of promotions or lateral transfers will come and get the approval of the commission, which we have done continuously in the past. I don't know where the ball dropped, or, I can't answer that. It just got to be a sort of a circle, but they are notified. The past commission, everything else. There's
Well,
nothing
and
that I
Chief-
did in transfers without notifying the Board of Fire Commissioners.
I guess I would just, as a follow-up to the first selectman, there's a difference between notification and coming before. I don't have the language of that motion in front of me.
Because it was in executive session.
No, the motion
Can't be.
at the May 9th meeting, the motion that was made that Attorney Trimbecki was referring to.
Mhm.
So I guess I would just ask for clarification and follow-up with the first selectman and the chief.
Okay, let me rephrase that. Chief, I think we're being asked to make sure that we get something from the commission, maybe back to this board, identifying what the motion is. My point was the motion couldn't have been in executive session because you're not
Right.
allowed to make any motions in
Yes, sir.
executive session. So
And
that's
they
all.
made it right after the executive session.
So
That's where
perhaps-
the motion came in.
Perhaps we can get just either the minutes, if it's clear in that, or...
Sure. I will see that
send
that's...
back. Who is the chair of the commission at this point?
The new chairman is Dr. Christie, Tom Christie.
And perhaps I can follow up with Dr. Christie just to confirm.
Sure, and I'll be
that.
glad
That
to,
would be good.
do that for you if you'd like. I'm
That
sorry
would-
if I misunderstood you. I didn't know where we were going,
but I think that's part of what I'm getting at, is I think that it's important that we have clarity on
Right.
this, and that we all understand and we're all on the same page.
Mhm.
You talked about notification
Yes.
versus approval. I think that it needs to be very clear, and I would like to make sure I'm very clear on what the process is, if there is a change, and how that's going to work, so.
Right. See, if there was a list, none of this would have taken place. We didn't have a promotion list, which, I just want to make that clear while I'm in front of the board, if I may. There was no promotional list, so therefore you have 90 days, and everyone was followed within a 90-day period, all right, by contract, to make a transfer. So, because there was no list. Now, we have a running list for promotion, so if anyone retires, we have a list, and they go right into that list. There's no lateral or, any 5% or 10% or anything like that. There is a list now, and I strongly suggest in the future that we keep a running list for exams, so things like this wouldn't happen again.
Well put, and simply as I understand it, it's kind of a contract requirement that we do that, so that would seem to be. I think one of the components of clarification, Kristen, if I might add on, is just that if I look on page 4 of Attorney Trimbecki's report, the bottom, item 3, it says the Fire Commission shall, and this is from the charter, the town charter, the Fire Commission shall have sole power to appoint and promote all positions in the department, and all appointments and promotions in the fire department shall be made on the basis of merit. I think that what we're trying to clarify here is to make sure that all promotions includes any acting or provisional appointments. And I think that's, when we talk about clarity in contract and rules, that's one of the things we want to be clear for both the chief as well as the fire commission involved. And that's why I was proposing as far back as January that the fire commission have an orientation on this, so they're all clear and up to date on what the definitions and rules are. As volunteers, not everybody has the time to go through the contract and all the detail, and I think we want to make sure that they do in this regard.
Right. Mr. Selectman, if I might add, that the contract supersedes the charter. So that's what we really, in following the charter, which we were doing in the beginning, we went to the contract, and that superseded whatever was in the charter, which has to be, addressed.
And Chief, the point of concern is that it's clear that the commission hadn't read the contract in detail, so it's hard to supersede something if you hadn't read the document. In particular, with the promotion list. And it clearly says in the contract, in section 4 on page 23, that whenever any such vacancy in a promotional position occurs and there is no appropriate eligibility list in existence, the Board of Fire Commissioners or its designated representative, within 90 days of the date of such vacancy, shall cause a competitive examination for that classification to take place. So I think that's your point's well taken in terms of there should be a list in place all the time. I think that it was, at least in the commissioners that I talked to, they weren't aware that it was their obligation to do that and to make sure that's in place. And I think that's part of the education process. It's not fair to volunteers if we're not helping them get oriented and understand what their obligations are within this. And as you pointed out, had that list been in place, there's a large part of the recent events that might not have taken place or might not have taken place to quite that extent.
Right, and not offering excuses if the storm Sandy didn't happen. It was scheduled for that Monday, which I'm sure you're aware of, Mr. Selectman, on that, which it was held off, and then we had 2 weeks of recuperate everything, so.
Chief, I think that was, it could have been done a lot sooner than that and should have been done a lot sooner than that, given the anticipation of the retirees that were coming and knowing that we needed that list in place. So I think that's where the commission has to, as the charter says, and again, as Attorney Trembecki's report points out, that by charter, the commission does have certain management responsibilities with the
Yes, sir.
department. We've got to make sure they're stepping up to doing those. And
Okay.
in that sense, they're working in concert with you to do some of that, to make sure that takes place.
I think the three parts of the question about the motion, you talked about acting and provisional, and then there's the lateral transfer piece, which is covered under Exhibit C, Appendix D, the general selection criteria for lateral movement. And part of my clarifying question is what role the commission may or may not have, or what role they believe that they had with respect to that motion. And again, that goes back to the first selectman's point about clarity of roles and responsibilities with that, because I think that's another kind of separate piece. And I do have another question with respect to the lateral transfers, if I may. This would be through you to the chief and/or Attorney Trembecki. Page 7 of the report notes that the vacancy must exist. It's in the Appendix D. It references it again. So the vacancy must exist before the lateral transfer can occur, and then that people must remain in the position for at least 3 years with certain exceptions. And I'm just wondering what the reason is for that requirement, what the background is. I don't know if that came up in your investigation, or if perhaps there was some history there. I wasn't clear about why that was in place.
The 3 years?
Yes.
Mr. Trembecki, you want to, I didn't write the contract, that's what's in there. You have to be in a position for 3 years, so, and do I believe in that? Yeah, of course I do, because you want to leave a person, for example, you know, I'll use the police department. Usually they leave a person in a position for 3 years and send them somewhere else so he can learn another position, like in the detective division. And then after 3 years, they take some of the detectives and they put them in the special services division. And you know, this is basically what we were doing here, which was agreed upon by all parties at that time. It didn't come out that way, but all parties agreed. And do I believe in people should learn all the jobs? Yes, definitely I do, instead of staying in one position for 15 and 20 years. I feel it's more beneficial to the town for people to know the different phases of the job. That's my personal opinion as the fire chief. And I know I held just about every position in the fire department. I was dispatcher, I was lieutenant, I was special services officer, and I think that's one of the reasons where I am today, because I had these different departments that I worked in, and it did help me along the way, and that's what I believe in.
Attorney Trembecki, did that come up at all in your conversations in any way?
I just, you know, I mean, like you read it in the contract, I can only speculate as to why it's there.
Okay.
What the chief says makes sense. The expectation would be that somebody would be in the position for 3 years so they'd learn the job, so to speak. But that's not what happened as it related to the laterals. And again, there's no control over when someone chooses to retire. I think, you know, the expectation is the person's going to be in the job for 3 years. The question is, is it someone, whether, in the case of Assistant Chief Chavanello, he wouldn't respond to my question, so I don't know really what the understanding was there in that case. But clearly, I think that's why that's in the contract. And just to go back to an earlier point that you had, I just looked at my notes from the Fire Commission meeting, and just to clarify the record, they voted on approving all provisional appointments in the future, not laterals, just provisional appointments, and also to try in the negotiations to not allow the pension to be calculated based on the salary on the last day, but rather some different criteria, perhaps 6 months, something like that. But again, that's all subject to negotiation, I assume.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, sir. My first question, and just backing up a minute, and Mr. Trembecki came before us a few months ago and gave us a presentation, but we hadn't seen this report for very long before then. So at that point in time, I had not had a chance to really thoroughly go through here. So without spending a ton of time on it, I do have a series of questions, and I'd like to whisk through the document at some point and get to them as efficiently as we can versus jumping around, if that at all makes sense.
Whatever works for you.
Specific to, actually, before I do that, I wanted to take 10 seconds of privilege here and for the chief. And a few weeks back, there was and this is unrelated to this, there was a fire up on Fogwood.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
And your guys went up there in record time, they knocked it down.
Right.
And it was in the garage.
Yes, sir.
And I think the house was saved for the most part. I don't know all the follow-up details of that. But the reason they were able to do that is because of the water suppression lines that we ran up those roads. I don't know what year it was, 6, 7 years ago.
I'm the one when Masopoulos was in office back then.
So it was even longer, okay.
And we went up into the Greenfield Hill area. I met with
Yeah.
different tenants up
Yeah.
in North Street and in there, and it took us maybe a year, maybe 2 years,
To
just
get
shooting
that.
from the hip here to get it.
Oh, yeah, me too, yeah.
And, that particular day, and matter of fact, I told the first selectman,
Yeah.
and I have to say it, I'm not being one of these heroes.
No.
I was one that pushed to get hydrants up there, and the hydrant was within 200 feet of the house, otherwise we would have lost the house.
No, and you've got a proud smile on your face for a very
No,
good reason.
yeah.
And we worked together on this to
Yeah,
get those
Kevin, I
up.
think you may be thinking back in, I'm going to say 2007-ish, there was an extension to that
Yeah.
Yes.
program that came before us on the Board of Finance.
Exactly.
So,
Yep.
I don't know if that was this, I can't remember if this leg was on that, but certainly we extended the.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
We did it in North Street area,
Yeah.
on the end of Burr Street where that house burned
Yeah,
down.
so you were within 200 feet, and the guys got there, and they were able to lay the hose, and I read the report, they laid this size hose, they laid that size hose, and they knocked it down in record time, and I would assume 10 years ago, before that hydrant was there, that would not have been possible.
Get it, we would have ran out of water. We only carry 500 gallons of water on the
Yeah.
apparatus. And,
Yeah.
they did a job. Did it start to spread into the house? Yes, sir, it did.
Right.
But what they did is we had lines go in the front door, up the stairs, and we pushed it out.
Yeah.
And we ventilated it and pushed it out, so it did.
Yeah. I mean.
They did a
that's
fantastic job, the
Yes,
firefighters,
I
not
mean,
because
that
I'm the
was
chief. but-
fantastic, and congratulations to you and all your guys, because, I mean, that was a project that we worked on, and, fire safety was the issue. It wasn't tapping in the water lines, it was fire safety, and it worked, so.
Thank you.
That's
Like to
fantastic.
hear the good things,
Hey, there's lots of good things.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Question for Mr. Trembecki. A few moments ago, the chief mentioned, and I believe I would refer to it on page 4 of your report, that the applicable law or the governing the governing document in this instance was the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, and not the town charter. Is that a statement you agree with?
No. I think the town charter, you have to understand sort of the way that everything stacks up. You have the town charter, first you have the Connecticut General Statutes, which
Right.
sort of empower fire commissions in general. Then you have the fire commission, which is as spelled out in the town charter, what its rights and responsibilities are to oversee the department. But I would say the town charter governs what the fire commission shall do or shall not do. It also spells out what the fire chief's role is in relation to both the fire commission and the first selectman. But then after that, as it relates to the details, the collective bargaining agreement does govern. So,
Right.
yeah, I shouldn't say no. Yes, he's right in certain respects, but I think in terms of how the law works, the town charter takes precedence. But the town charter doesn't speak to all of these various
Right.
issues.
So there's some gray areas, but there's some hierarchy there as well.
Hierarchy, right, but
Okay.
I would say, to use an analogy, that the town charter sort of is maybe the skeleton, and the collective bargaining agreement is much more the meat and potatoes, to the extent
Yeah.
that it really governs the day-to-day relations between the parties.
Okay. So with that said, and kind of tying that back to the earlier comments about the fire commission, their roles and responsibilities, and I know there's a program in place to train them or to orient them, thank you, on their roles and responsibilities. Under the current charter, it was my understanding, and I might be wrong, but it was my understanding that they currently had either the charge or the responsibility to approve promotions and
Yes,
transfers.
you're right.
They do.
And it's, and specifically paragraph, it's in the report at page 4 at the bottom, subject to the provisions in this charter regarding the appointment of the chief, the fire commission shall have the sole power to appoint and promote to all positions in the department. And all appointments and promotions in the fire department shall be made on the basis of merit. So I went back and looked at the minutes. There's no reference that any of these promotions were approved by the fire, the promotions that we're talking about were approved by the fire commission per se. Now, it was pointed out by Mr. Saxel that these things would have been discussed in executive session. I find it hard to believe if there may have been a discussion in executive session, but then I would think that they would go back on the record and say the promotion of Officer or Lieutenant Smith is now effective, that there will be some record of it. I found none.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that even though they are emphasizing their role going forward as part of this motion, it's more of a clarification of a role and a responsibility they already had.
Correct.
And should have been exercising.
Correct.
And possibly, while they would have discussed it in executive session out back, clearly a motion or an approval should have been done in the front room in public session.
That would be my way of thinking.
Okay. I happen to agree with that. I'm just trying to understand the chain of events, so, okay.
And there's some issue about this question of acting versus provisional. And, the acting person, and there is a distinction, just contrary to what the chief says. The acting person is somebody who's filling a role for a short period of time while somebody's sick or, and then expected to come back.
Right.
And that person goes back into their other job.
Right.
Or their other position within the department and doesn't accrue the benefits of the provisional. Because once you become a provisional, and even though the word is provisional, it's not a permanent promotion, all the benefits accrue. And that's where I think the gap is. None of those provisional promotions ever came, if they came before the fire commission, there's no record in the minutes that they approved any of that.
Okay. And my last follow-on to that is, in your opinion, is that something that they should have been informed about as a matter of fact, or something they should have been discussing and then acting on?
I can't speak to that, Mr. Kiley, because I don't know what happened. The only thing I can say is what's in the documents, what's in the charter, what's in the
Right.
collective bargaining agreement. So I can't speak to what they knew or didn't know or when they knew it. But those are the rules, so to speak. So
Let me rephrase that, because
Yeah.
I think I said it the wrong way. Knowing that they had the role and responsibility to act upon those things, it would therefore be illogical for me to assume that it would be okay to just simply inform them, hey, I'm doing these things, or we are doing these things. There should have been more than that. There should have been a discussion and a vote, at the very least, a discussion.
I think an approval process certainly would have been required to be in place. And back to the first selectman's comments about the list, and the language is mandatory. It says, shall create a list. Reading from our page 23, Article 25, promotions. Whenever there's any vacancy in a promotional position occurs and there's no list in existence, the Board of Fire Commissioners or its designated representative within 90 days of such vacancy shall cause a competitive exam to take place. Shall. It's clear. Can't mean anything other than that. Now, I understand that, events intervened. Hurricane Sandy was certainly unanticipated. But it seems to me, again, if you were discharging the language of the contract, that's what's supposed to have happened. And look, I mean, I get it. Hurricane, that was a catastrophe, as you well know.
Right.
But at some point, life went on again. So.
No, thank you for those answers. I do appreciate that clarification of those events.
May I follow up?
Yes, please.
Because I think that circles around
It
to
did.
how I started, and one of the
Yeah.
reasons why there was confusion to me in terms of the motion was because of the clear language
Yeah.
as well. And I think I would agree, as the First Selectman and Selectman Kiley have also said, that we need to, as we bring people on board, and here Ms. Brennan is here as a new Fire Commission member being educated, that we have an obligation as a town, as town employees, as members of the fire department, to be sure that the members of this commission are very clear about that. And in turn, when we appoint members of boards and commissions, part of our hope and expectation is that they will also reach out and be clear about what their responsibility is as well. So yes, I thank you for kind of going further into that, because that was kind of the genesis of those first questions that I had. It was a confusing motion, and is it really a change when this is what the language sets forth before us?
Yeah, that was.
One thing that I would say to you is that this contract is complicated. It took me, I've been doing this for a long time. It took me quite a while to get my head around it and understand all the nuances and different provisions of the contract. And I'm not suggesting that the Fire Commission needs to know all the details, but certainly they need to have a working understanding of what's in this contract, because a lot of what happens, particularly as it relates to grievances and things of that nature, one of which came up in the context of this case, really relate to the work rules and things like that that are spelled out in the contract. And I know the chief is very familiar with the contract, as are the members of the fire department. It does take a little living with and spending some time to truly understand all of the differences. And I think that, and again, wouldn't expect the commission of volunteers to have that detailed knowledge of this contract, but it is incumbent to try to understand it as best you can, because it is confusing.
Yeah, fair enough.
Kyle?
Well, I wanted to go through the document if I could.
Go right
Is that okay? Is that
May-
okay?
may
And
I just
I think I can be brief.
Well, I support you. I wrote up some notes so I wouldn't forget, but I think it has been a long time, this conversation. I am very supportive. I think it's been a while, so I think it's great.
And I think
support
I've already
that.
summarized most of the questions and notes here. I think I could do it pretty quickly.
Sure.
Right? So if we could just start on page 1. I just have some basic questions, and within the introduction section, within the charge, it talks about to investigate any and all issues. And I guess my question there is, were you able to investigate all the issues, to your knowledge?
Well, the only thing that I would say is that I relied on the cooperation of people with knowledge about these events, including fire department personnel as well as town personnel, and I list there the people that I spoke to. The only thing that would have been perhaps a little easier, would have really sort of gotten underneath all of the issues, would have been to take depositions and things of that nature. But early on, it was decided not to do that. And again, I'm not suggesting that anybody said anything that was false or misleading or anything like that. It's just that would, and to be able to really, we can get a lot more information that way, in my experience. But again, I'm not suggesting that anybody was less than truthful.
So you generally feel good about that
Yes.
statement? Okay.
Yeah, but no one, everyone was cooperative. People took time. There was no, with the exception of retired Assistant Chief Chavanello. I did speak to him. He wanted to think about whether or not he'd cooperate and talk to me. He called me back to say that he didn't want to, and so be it.
Okay, so in everyone here you spoke to, and by default, the ones that aren't on here were the ones that did not return your call?
Either didn't return calls, or I had one that was a bad phone number I had for somebody. But most people, I was surprised, quite honestly, at the level of candor and cooperation that I got from people who really, once they're retired, quite honestly, They were under no obligation to talk to me.
That's correct. Good. The next section is the applicable law section, and
Yep.
we've already touched on that a little bit. I do have a question up in section, first paragraph 1, top of page 3. Can you just help me define the specific roles of the first selectman and the fire chief as they relate to these matters, these types of issues, and how they're defined and where?
Well, the charter, the state statute provides no guidance, really, as it relates to that. The only thing that does speak to that is the charter, which is at section 9.22D, supervision, which says that the fire chief shall report to the first selectman on matters of administration and operation, and to the fire commission on matters of policy. So that's it in terms of what the law is, so to speak. And I would imagine that the level of reporting is probably varies depending on who's sitting in Mr. Tetro's chair.
Right. And without jumping too far ahead, that was one of my subsequent questions. Did you find the majority of these issues to be policy or administration or a little bit of both?
A little bit of both.
I'm just trying to determine where the ultimate decision should have been made.
Well, I think a little bit of both. The question of promotions is very clear in the charter as to what the fire commission's role is as it relates to promotions. They're responsible to approve promotions. And I can't, as I said earlier, I can't see any evidence that these provisional promotions were actually approved by the fire commission. In terms of administration, you know, that's a pretty broad word, so I wouldn't imagine that the fire chief would call the first selectman every 5 minutes and say, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do the other thing, because he's the chief, and that's his job to run the department as he sees fit. And that's kind of what happened as it related to these promotions, if you will.
Okay. Just a follow-on on that. How would the charter dictate or kind of govern the relationship between the first selectman and the fire chief? Because one does report to the other. So I'm just trying to relate it to like my corporate experience where me, the manager, I might have the ability to do something, but I still need to report back to somebody, whether it's officially or unofficially, and I don't know where those lines are drawn in these examples and where the buck stopped.
Well, I think as in your analogy to a corporation is probably a good one. Mr. Tetro sits as the CEO, so ultimately he's responsible for everything that happens in the town, even for things he had nothing to do with or anything. But that's how it goes, and he's ultimately accountable to the voters and to the citizens of the town of Fairfield. But in terms of day-to-day management, just as the CEO of IBM doesn't have all of his managers or her managers reporting to her every day, it's the same kind of chain of command that you would expect. You know, I think that's an issue of management style, really, as to how involved the first selectman is going to get in any department, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to add on from my perspective, obviously, when you're talking about, you know, somebody doesn't show up at work and the director of DPW has somebody else ride the truck that day, if you need to make adjustments for a snowplow emergency, if somebody doesn't show up for a shift on the police department, there's a sub-capacity there. If somebody doesn't show up for a shift and given minimum manning on the fire department, we have to replace that person. There's a program lined out. So between the charter that specifically spells out the fire commission approves all promotions and appointments, and the contract that also spells out the formula by which that all happens, that really governs the transactions in this case from that standpoint. And as I've gone through this, I've been looking to see if there's anything else that I might have missed in doing some of that, and it appears that it was all covered through as we understood it and as how it transpired.
Thank you. The next thing I had highlighted, I think we've already touched on this, it's the sentence, page 3, second paragraph. The most significant legal document is the CBA. Maybe I'm mincing words, but it's really a combination of that and the town charter, or the town charter, or I just don't know what that sentence, what that really means.
I think what I was driving at is that the CBA has got so much detail in it as it relates to promotions and how promotions are supposed to happen and how what happens when somebody goes out on sick leave, and what happens to people's pay when they're made a provisional appointment, what happens with lateral transfers. That's where all the detail is. So that's, to my way of thinking, in terms of trying to understand what happened, that's really the document that drives the analysis.
Okay. All right, well, continuing on, the next section is the allegations, and we've already been through a lot of that, the letter, the allegations. We've already had a meeting on that with the chief, as has the Board of Finance, and I think that stuff is all pretty well in the public record, as is how I feel about that, so I don't think there's really a need to, rehash all of that, people being promoted within a certain number of days, and all of those details of that section. Going forward into the applicable law, again, we have touched on this. I think Section 3 that you referred us to, Mr. Trembecki, did help me understand that the Fire Commission probably had some responsibilities and roles and powers that they either weren't exercising or needed to know that they were supposed to be exercising them in a public fashion. I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think the charter says what it says. I can only
Yeah.
tell you what's in the record, and what's in the record is what's contained in the minutes.
Okay. The next, page 5, I just have a couple highlighted here. It ties back to what Mr. Tetra was just talking about. I'm still, I know the first selectman has power over the fire department pursuant to administration and the execution of all laws. So, I mean, I'm still not completely clear on who the ultimate authority is, and there's a section that we'll get to later on that discusses the lateral transfers, and I'll tie that back to this at that point in
Okay.
time, because it talks about a couple different meetings that took place, and I'm not sure which is the which meeting had the proper protocol followed. Going on, it just talks about who they report to, and I think that's all fine. The next section that I wanted to get some clarification on, and it is confusing, and I think it was confusing even to one of the guys that you spoke to in the report, was this whole acting versus provisional, and I know provisional affects pension benefits and acting would not. Can you just go through that one more time so at least
Sure.
I can understand
Sure.
what an acting, because they aren't synonymous as I
They're
think
not.
maybe we have used them incorrectly in the past.
They're not.
And there are specific differences between them, so could you just,
Acting, the way I sort of have it in my mind, and I think this is true to the language in the contract, is acting is somebody is sick. And in accordance with the minimum manpower clause, you have to have X number of people in X number of roles on each particular shift. So someone gets put into that job on a temporary basis for that person. Now, in the event that someone is sick, and they're going to be sick for a while, the acting position needs to remain open for 8 weeks. And then the jobs are filled on the basis of overtime during that eight-week period. So you cannot put somebody into a provisional role to fill that slot during that 8-week period. Now, once 8 weeks is up, then the position is eligible to be it's promotable. In this case, and there are times where you can go longer than 8 weeks.
Right.
You don't have to put anybody in the position. You can just continue to fill it with acting.
or overtime?
Right, and overtime.
Right.
So, as a manager, and I'm sure the chief made a decision that, by filling it with an acting person, it's costing us more money. So that by putting somebody in the role on a quote-unquote provisional basis, promoting basis, that will reduce the overtime expense. I understand that, but it wasn't consistently done as far as I could tell.
Okay. So are both acting and provisionals subject to the same seniority list?
Yeah, the acting spot, I believe, and the chief will correct me if I'm wrong here, the acting spots are to be filled from the seniority list, so that the most senior person on the list gets the opportunity to fill the job. And that's what's supposed to happen with the provisionals as well. The most
Okay.
senior person, when there's no list in place, the most senior person gets the opportunity to move into the slot.
So that governs both of those, okay?
Right.
All right, okay. If I go to page 7 and jump in whatever you want, when it goes in section 6 under the overtime area, it talks about the 8 weeks that you just touched on,
Yep.
and I think I understand that. The question I have is, were any of the provisionals, well, Are the laterals subject to the same 8 weeks as the provisionals are?
Lateral's a totally different.
Okay, then let's leave that
yeah,
to the side.
okay.
So were any of the provisionals acted upon prior to 8 weeks going by?
No,
No?
no. That part of, no. And I would think that had that happened, there would have been a grievance. Because that 8
Okay.
weeks is very clear. The position needs to be remain open during that time.
Okay. So there were no cases where a provisional was moved into the spot where the spot had not been open for
At least 8 weeks.
8 weeks.
Correct.
Now, once that happens, and then that provisional moves on to something else, you don't need to wait 8 more weeks. You can do something the next day with a second provisional. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
So if I'm out for 10 weeks and my spot gets filled, the 8 weeks have gone by.
Someone retires, and then someone else goes in the spot, yes.
Okay, so
that
you
can
could
happen.
have a short-term revolving
Yep.
door, one set of 8 weeks goes by?
Right.
Okay, and that seems to be what happened?
To some degree, it did, yes.
Okay, all right. There were some comments along the way, and, you know, whether they were, well, the first thing is in the analysis section. There's a comment here about how the CBA and how it had been implemented in the past. And I'm not sure of the relevance of that, because most of these, all 14 of these examples took place from the year 2010 forward. In fact, the lion's share of them in the last 6 months.
The only, the reason that I brought that up, and it's one of the vague aspects of this entire thing, is this question of past practices. And that's something that Mr. Saxel brought up in his defense response from the chief.
Right.
That there are these past practices. And I reference it somewhere here where we talked about the lateral transfer to the training ground where
Yeah, I saw that.
page 11, Chief Fellner had given me a letter from Chief Russell indicating that this kind of practice had occurred in the past. So this question of past practices, which everybody seems very familiar with, but they're not written down anywhere. And I know the union grieves these things in accordance with past practices. My only thing is, you know, I come from, you know, the legal world. In the legal world, there's a lot of gray areas, as you well know, but the idea is to try to create certainty so that everybody knows where they stand, so that if I were joining the department tomorrow as a new police chief, a new fire chief, I'd know what I was able to do and what I wasn't able to do vis-a-vis the staff.
Right.
And there's this body of knowledge of these past practices, and I know it comes up because I know there are grievances filed all the time, and the chief will talk about it, but it's not written down anywhere. You know, maybe that's something that should be considered or something that should be spelled out in a new collective bargaining agreement.
Specifically in this contract, the specific past practices are not spelled out, but the policy of following past practice is spelled out.
But-
So that's,
Promise, you know,
Well,
that's,
Yeah.
that's, if I look for clarity and communication, and that's one of the issues I think that we want to improve on going forward.
and that's probably, and again, you know, I just give you my own thought. I mean, as a concept of negotiating a new contract, there are ways, if there are things that have been controversial in the past, they can be included in the contract, sort of as an example. This is how we, just so we're all clear, in the event that this happens, this is how it goes down. And there is some of that in here, but, you know, there's not, it's not all in
right.
there.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind for me is the age of a past practice, because it looks to me on paper that everything that has happened here is specifically in the last 6 months. There's some of it that goes back to 2010, but then there's a significant gap going backward from 2010, and I don't even know how far back it goes. A decade rings a bell, where you didn't see this. At least I haven't seen it, so I don't know where the past practice prior to 2010 would have come from to make the 2010 stuff acceptable going forward to drive this stuff. And I have to wonder out loud, you know, if just because something was done in 1975 or 1985, and I'm just pulling numbers from the air, does it make it proper or right today?
Right.
So, just, you know. it's
And I
kind of
think the issue there is not, well, what you're saying is very reasonable. The issue is really what the arbitrators or mediator might say when you come to
Yeah.
a grievance.
Right.
Okay.
That's all.
Definitely.
And there's,
No.
you're right, there's no clear answer on that.
Mhm.
I think we can definitely do a better job of making it clear so that.
Yeah, as
doesn't have
best
to
you
come
can
up.
in the negotiating process, but that takes
Yeah.
two to.
And, yep.
Yeah.
Kristen?
I just
Please.
want to follow up with the past practice piece. I agree completely, and I think the question is about the legality piece in terms of how it falls out in bargaining and in arbitration and in conversation. But I also just want to note that I think what Attorney Turnbecki said is very significant in that opening up the process and being clear with the practice allows equal access, particularly for the most junior firefighters who tend to be, they're the newest on the block, they don't have the same kind of knowledge and experience. And that's where that is of particular concern to me. Certainly for everyone within the organization, but especially for those who are newest to it. So I think that's a critical issue.
Okay, I'm on page 8, and just something else that kind of jumped out at me, and this is mentioned in a couple different places, maybe 3 different places, including the conclusion, is that it was what I'm calling the speculation amongst the guys that things were going to change, that the next agreement might not be as, could be different. Sorry. But I just,
Just to clarify?
yeah, please.
It's not speculation. The union agreement had changed, they'd signed that. That had, these guys, they're retiring under the agreement, and one of the issues was retiring by a certain date in order to get their COLA for that point, otherwise they'd lose it for a couple of years.
That I understand.
Okay, that was in writing for a couple of years ahead of time.
Right, but that said, the way I read this, and the way some of the explanations were given to me in person, was that the ongoing contract negotiations, there could be some substantive changes that might make it more conducive to do something now rather than waiting. And those things weren't all yet decided at last October, November, December, when much of this activity was taking place.
Well, I think, just every one of the retirees that I spoke to brought that point up, as well as the current
Right.
members of the department, that there was a sense and a feeling that the next contract, in whatever manner, may not be
Right.
as generous or may result in some sort of cutback in benefit or wage scale or whatever. And again, it's impossible to know what that's going to be because the contract hasn't been negotiated yet. But there was a
Right.
feeling among all of the folks that we don't think the next contract's going to be as good, so, I'm going to go now.
Yeah, okay. I only bring it up because I'm not sure if it makes what transpired, easier or more difficult for me to understand or to, buy into. It's just, it's a lot of opinion and it's a lot of speculation at that point on those items. And I think maybe, the guys knew enough to look ahead and make some decisions today, which I don't blame them for doing. I mean, it's perfectly normal, human nature thing to do, so I'm not judging that, but it seemed like a lot of stuff happened in a short period of time.
Well, I think there was a confluence of events. First of all, you also had a population that was eligible.
Yeah.
And if you look at the seniority list, and I guess it's just kind of the way it happens in terms of how people get hired into the department and when they all age out at a certain point. And that's just it just kind of is what it is. But you did have a number of firefighters all hit the requisite criteria and made decisions.
Okay. All right, the next couple of things we've already touched on and talked about. I really wanted to next start talking about, let me get to the right page if you don't mind.
Sure.
The bottom of page 10, let's just start there, I guess. And I'm not looking to go down a road here that we don't want to go down, but I do want some clarification of the statement that there is no direct evidence that any of these things were part of an agreement or provided any particular benefit of any type to anyone. So I just want to know how you were able to come to that conclusion.
Well, I have no evidence that anybody got together and sat down and had a cup of coffee and said, look, here's what we're going to do. Let's put this plan in place to help everybody retire and retire and get enhanced benefits. There was no discussion like that, as far as I could tell. But that said, I mean, the facts are the facts. Everybody knew what the contract provided.
Yeah.
Everybody understood how it worked.
Yeah.
There was really no reason for anyone to sit down and come to an agreement per se, because I think it was really pretty much everyone understood what would happen and how these things work. Now, did anybody say, "Hey, put me in this job, I'm going to retire the next day"? No, there's no evidence of any of that. But they were all retirement eligible. And in some cases, there were some, I think it was the Assistant Chief Curry, or Lieutenant Curry, who had he told me that his intention to retire was well known. I think, in one case, as it related to Chavanello, the chief thought he was going to stay longer than he actually decided to. So that there was a general understanding that people were thinking about retiring.
Right. So there was a general understanding, and whether it was 9 days or 1 day, nobody knew. And as the chief has pointed out to us a couple times, what they did was, what happened was within the boundaries of, it was within the four corners of the contract, and that's the way it played out.
Okay. Could
Is that
I
fair?
add something to that, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Commissioner Bickey?
Yeah.
As far as Curry's concerned, I won't say this, don't take it personal. According to him and Mr. Saxel, and I talked to him, and I believe he wrote a letter that he didn't want to accept that position. He was senior to Chavanello, and he didn't want it. And I believe you have a letter on that from Curry stating that, that wasn't true, because he was offered it and said he didn't want it at that time because Chavanello stated he was going to stay for that period of time. So I just want to make that clear. Curry wasn't passed. So I think there was just, on everyone's part, a little misunderstanding on that. But we do have a letter from Curry, and I believe Mr. Trambicki's aware of that he didn't want it at that time. So I went to the next senior man by contract, and that was Chavanello. Well, when all this happened and an individual put in a grievance, they all jumped on it, and that was the time to get out by August or April 1st. So I just wanted to clear that up on Curry's
All right.
part.
So those are the questions I have on the provisionals. I did want to go next into this fire training issue for the three guys that are involved there. And my first question is, I'm on the bottom of page 11, and it refers to a conversation between the chief and the first selectman with a response back to Chief Tracy, and it goes on to say that the upshot of the meeting was it was not going to happen.
Right.
That's how I'm reading this, right?
That's correct.
Is that fair to say?
In terms of what was related outside of that, I don't know. In terms of the meeting that the chief and Art Reed had with Mr. Mayor and myself, the chief relayed that he was planning on making this transfer, and I told him I wasn't comfortable with it because Chavanello had planned on leaving by March.
Okay. And that's how I read this as well. So if I'm reading this correctly and following the chain of events, it sounds like there was a meeting to discuss it. There was questions and pushback by the first selectman to the chief. And as a result of that first meeting, the word that went back to Lieutenant Tracy, or Assistant Chief Tracy at the time, was that the transfer was not going to take place.
Correct.
And then a whole bunch of things happened. There was back and forth. And it goes on all the way through page 12. And then on page, what page it was, at some point in time, I saw a reference that the fire chief came back to the first selectman and just informed him that it was going to happen.
Correct.
Okay, so, and this is probably a question for you, so I'm not understanding the chain of events. It sounds like at some point in time, there was a meeting that you were a part of as his boss, and there was a difference of opinion on should we, could we, will we be doing this? And the answer initially was, I guess not. A whole bunch of things took place, there was back and forth, there was whatever happened, and then the chief came back and basically, it sounds like he just came back to you and informed you we're doing this. So it sounded like the first time there was a discussion potentially looking for agreement or permission, and the second time it sounds like it was, this is what's happening. Is that at all?
That's what the report says, and I
So
think
I'm
that's...
just kind of, I
that's-
just don't get that.
Yeah, and pretty much the chief came back and said for the good of the department, he needed to make this change, and on his responsibility, he was going to do it. And simply put, as I read the contract, he has the authority to do that. He was clear that he was, and so that's how we left it.
So you're okay with that position change by yourself from one conversation to the
My
other?
position didn't change.
Okay.
All right, the issue is it's the chief's authority per the contract to make those personnel decisions.
Okay. So that brings me back to, and that's a good point, but that does bring me back to the hierarchy that we talked about before, and I'm not sure who governs in that case. Is it the CEO telling the fire chief, yes or no, you can or cannot do something? Or is it the fire chief acting within the four corners of the contract saying, I can, I will, I'm going to? That's my disconnect.
My conclusion was that the fire chief made the decision, and that if he ran it past the first selectman said, hey, you're the chief, essentially, do what you see fit, if you think you need to do this to run your department most effectively. And I think the chief's expectation was that this would be done via an agreement among all parties, and that's where there's a lot of confusion as to what happened after that.
Okay. So
And again, just to follow up,
Sure.
and to be clear, with any department, including the police department, any positional change like that is not something that the first selectman signs off on. In this case specifically, per the contract, and in this case, the collective bargaining agreement does govern, because that's what the union would use to grieve if they did, and that's how it would be enforced.
Okay.
So while the town charter is helpful in some respects, once it's agreed to, and we've been through this with a number of negotiating points as we've gone back in the last year and resolved 5 different contracts. It's clearly that, and it's something that specific, the collective bargaining agreement is the one that's going to be upheld, because the grievance process will go through and point back to that and uphold it.
Okay. Okay, so that said,
May I
Go ahead,
follow up?
Kristen.
oh, I'm sorry.
Just to jump in, so
Yep.
essentially, if I'm hearing correctly, you expressed that you did not agree with that, but you deferred to what was written in the document, which is the Appendix D, that essentially spells out that piece for the chief, because that's what any grievance would be based on.
Yeah, specifically, from a matter of public safety, the first selectman shouldn't be the person picking who drives the truck, who gets up on the ladder, who's going to be the first guy into the house, who's going to sit back. That is the chief. That's what we need. When we look at Storm Sandy, Storm Nemo, the chief and police chief, fire chief, from a public safety standpoint, they're in the best position to judge who fills that role. And at that time, that was all this was. Who's going to fill this role? All right, I wasn't comfortable the first time because Chevelle was going to move out in 6 months, and I didn't think that was a long enough period of time to do it. Coming back in, the chief has the authority and knows the personnel better, and felt this was extremely important for the department. And I'm not going to step into a personnel decision when I'm not familiar with all the facts of the people involved.
Fair enough, thank you. Okay, let's talk about the vacancy now. Can you give me a general sense, when you're looking at a lateral
Come
transfer,
back to it.
give me a general sense on what the criteria are for the creation of a vacancy?
Well, in order to make a provisional appointment, a provisional promotion, there needs to be an opening. You've got to create an opening.
Right.
And as it was, there was no opening. With
Right.
Tracy in the job, the training job,
Right.
there was no opening. And the only way to make an opening, if you will, was to transfer him out of the position. So the chief went into this thinking, okay, fine, if we're going to do this, I want to do it on the basis of an agreement, and thought there was an agreement, in fairness to the chief. Assistant Chief Tracy says he didn't think there was an agreement. And there are some conflicting evidence all the way around.
About those meetings and all that
About the
stuff.
meetings and
Yeah.
whether he shook hands and whether he was forced and whether he reneged, all that sort
All
of
that
stuff.
stuff. Yep, it's all documented. here.
That's all spelled out
It
in
is.
here.
Thank you for
But
that.
in order to make a lateral transfer, there's got to be an opening to put someone in the transfer and to put someone in the slot.
Is that how that reads?
Yeah.
So is it?
Could
is-
you
I'm
just
sorry.
go
Sure,
back
I'm sorry.
and cover that to see how that reads, please?
This is on Exhibit C, it's called Appendix D, General Selection Criteria for Lateral Movement and Job Descriptions. Step 1, opening exists by vacancy, request for transfer, or administrative decision to transfer. So in order to create that position, there had to be one of those things. Either somebody quit, retired, or there's a request for a transfer, or an administrative decision. So what we say in the, what I say in the report is that the chief had the authority administratively to do this had he chose to do so. His statements in front of the Board of Finance were that this was done by agreement, and that's what he told me. My only point here is, in my report, is that there is some dispute as to whether there was an agreement or not.
Right.
But in order for a position to be created, you had to have a position first.
Right. So whether there was an agreement in place or not, the chief had the power to make an administrative
Correct.
decision to create a vacancy by moving somebody, even against their will, to another spot.
Correct.
So that's, he had that complete authority to do that. So actually, the agreement, while it muddied the waters thereafter and created a lot of, back and forth on, what I want to do and what I agree to and all that stuff, that almost doesn't matter, because even without that, he had the unilateral authority to just move somebody from a position at his own discretion without getting it approved by either the first selectman or the fire commission to move people around.
He had the authority to do it. My only point here is that that's not what was represented, that it was said that this was done by an agreement and it wasn't
Okay.
done administratively, but yes, he had the power to do it. That's not what was said, though. What was said was it was done by an agreement.
So it was portrayed as the result of an agreement that turned out to be later in question, but even with that being the case, he could still do
He
it
could have done it.
anyway.
Yes.
Okay, is that, I'm just trying to understand the,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
An agreement was made, they came to me. I
Okay.
didn't go to them. I didn't decide, well, I want to transfer this man from here to there. Two union members, the president and secretary, Smith and Tuttle, came to me with Tracy, with Chavanillo, and wanted to talk to me. And Chavanillo wanted to go down to training center, and at that time, Tracy agreed in the office with the union president. That's why there was no controversy or anything else. Well, several days later, we got a letter from Tracy that he talked to his family and his wife, and he changed his mind. That's where all of this started. And that's the fact. The union was there. The union called me and says they didn't know also that he did it. And at that time, it was already taken place, which Mr. Saxel also sent in a report on that after talking with the union and the members. So, we didn't want to prolong it and make a big deal out of it.
Right. And my concern is not, there was a lot going on there, and I wasn't in the room, and I can't opine on that. My concern is not really with the agreement, and I know there's a lot of material about that. I think my bigger concern is that, for reasons unknown to me, or that I have yet to understand, is that you made an administrative decision, with or without an agreement, to move 3 people around, potentially out of order the first time because the CBA seniority list wasn't followed, but I'm less concerned about that, but I'm more concerned about that event took place, or those events took place, for no apparent reason than what I've read is to give Mr. Tracy some time on the line.
Definitely.
And he disagrees with that.
I know he
And I'll
does.
leave that to the side as well. But within 10 days, those 2 guys retired. One within 9 days and one within 1 day. So within 10 days, a lot happened, and especially
Right.
the second time, the second person went in and took the spot that the first person had, and then he retired the very next day. So a lot happened in 10 days, a lot happened in 1 day, and it seems to be driven administratively, and it seems to be driven potentially without agreement or without logic for me to understand why it was all done. And the end result is there were retirements at higher dollars for both of those guys within a very short period of time, and that's what bothers me.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, because at that time,
Bless you.
God bless you, when Tracy grieved it, they all found out about it, and they
Yeah.
said, well, if he wins the grievance, everybody goes back where they were, so that's bad.
Understood, but
That's what happened.
That's
So-
after the fact,
That,
right?
well, it was really not after the fact, sort of before the
Okay,
fact.
and
Kristen,
I
you
don't
had
want to have a
follow-up
debate.
question on that?
I want to follow up because I also want to note that when I look at the various aspects of this report and what's happened, I really see the lateral transfer situation as different and unique in terms of, as opposed to the acting and provisional piece of it. And I think, what I'm hearing here today and what I've heard and listened to over time, what the first selectman just said a few minutes ago was that his discomfort with the transfer was because there was an expectation that one of the members of the department was leaving, the member who had come to you. What you just said was they came to you.
Yeah, they all
Right,
wanted
so
to be,
they-
Tracy wanted to go on the line, Chavanilla wanted to go down to training center,
And
which he was a training
that's
officer.
different, that's different than what Assistant Chief Tracy is saying. He's
Well, I
saying.
can't help, and
but
Dick
my-
Saxel gave a report on that.
You know what,
Chief,
if I
you
can
would, if you just
finish.
let her
Yeah, I
finish,
know.
please.
I also heard you say earlier that the value, the reason that I asked about the 3-year piece is because part of the value in transferring into those positions is that you are giving people experience so that they can learn the job. And if there's someone who is looking to retire, it doesn't make sense to me that they are being given experience in that position when there may be others who could use that experience. And I think, Selectman Kiley makes a good point, the whole conversation about the agreement. You did have the administrative power to do that, so in a sense, it's interesting, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that is a piece. I think that there's been a lot of conversation, the whole four corners of the contract and what the contract allows, and I think, just want to quote what Attorney Trembecki said in the report. There were discretionary management decisions made by the chief which were not required by the contract. And I think my comment, that's from the report, is that just because these actions were allowable doesn't mean that they're required or, in my opinion, the right thing to do. I think that you have, as the chief, have been a longtime leader in this department. I want to say that I am grateful for all that you have done for the town and your sacrifice, dedication, and long-term commitment. And certainly, I have worked with many people who I share values, beliefs, and behaviors and have great respect for, and I often don't always agree with their opinions or actions. And in this particular decision, I just want to be clear, I don't agree with the action that was taken, and for the reasons that are being discussed here. I think it's concerning, and I understand that it was, again, that quote keeps coming back within the four corners of the contract, but I think there are some concerning pieces to this for me. So I just wanted to follow up on what Selectman Kiley
Thank
said
you
about
for that,
that.
I appreciate that.
What I might add, what you
Just-
said, there'll
well,
probably
just a
be
couple, and then I'm
the
almost
other
done.
people that were qualified to go down to training center, by all means, but I followed the seniority list. Now, if Chavanillo said no, I would have went to the next man. Are there other people that I believe younger that should be in different positions? By all means.
And-
They're the future of the fire department, so why not teach them now, than wait till the last minute and say, okay, here it is, you're the fire training center, you're the fire marshal. You've got a plan ahead to say this is where the departments go. And,
May I ask a question, just a follow-up, because that was actually one of my questions. The seniority piece seems very clear to me in terms of the acting provisional, but when I look at the Appendix D, and I look at step 4 in the process, so it says from available personnel left after steps 1 through 3, and evaluation on the following criteria: desirable knowledge, skills, and ability, past performance, overall needs of the department, and confidence of superiors. I wondered specifically if the seniority provisions also are required here, or if those A through D in step 4 supersede, excuse me, supersede the seniority piece for the lateral transfer. I don't know if either of you can answer that in terms of from the
I'm missing
contract, if
something here. I
that's.
don't
I
know.
think she, are you reading from
Exhibit C.
Exhibit
Appendix D?
C, Appendix
She's
D.
reading
Yeah.
It talks about
Right,
the
step
steps
four, you're
for,
reading?
Yeah.
yes, correct, in step 4.
So if you want to start, yes, this-
Okay. Step 4, okay, from available personnel, left after steps 1, 2, 3, evaluation to the following. That was all taken. Chavanilla was a training officer. Matter of fact, when he requested to get out of the training center after he was there for several years, that's when I put Tracy in that particular place. Okay, so the same thing happened 10 years ago. I mean, I'm just shooting from the hip here. The same exact thing happened there. And if you read the last paragraph, where all parties agree on page 57, that's exactly what happened. Last paragraph. All parties agree.
May I follow up on that, please? And I guess my question is to the chief, without beating a dead horse here, but if you look at page 12, it does talk about, it refers to Appendix D, and it requires a lateral to remain in the position for 3 years. So I'm reading that to say that if I'm moved laterally, that I am agreeing to stay there for 3 years, because that's in the best interest of the department, for me to learn that job, experience it, and, you know, benefit my career at the town, the
Right.
department, and all that. So my question is, if that 3-year requirement is there for a lateral, help me understand why we would make 2 lateral movements to guys that, according, I heard Mr. Tetro say earlier, one of the guys was openly speaking of retiring in a few months, and I don't know if the other person had referenced an upcoming or pending retirement, but they were both of retirement age and they were both close, and there seemed to be this confluence of events where people were looking to be moving on before the next contract came. So it shouldn't have been a surprise that either one of those guys might be on a short list or a short time frame to retire.
Right.
And knowing that they're going laterally to a spot that requires them to stay there 3 years, I just don't understand the business logic of why I would think about, or why you would think about doing that if they were potentially pending retirements.
Okay. Chavanello went in there, and he was going to stay there until March or April. April 1st, they had to get out, or they'd lose that cost of living, all right? When Tracy put in the grievance, that changed the whole picture, because everybody said, I'm getting out of here, because if he wins the grievance, as I said before, they could all go back where they were. Well, of course, they get 10% more by working a day shift in the training center, and they get a
Understood,
vehicle.
yeah.
They get 10% more, they get a vehicle, and they work 4 days a week.
Okay.
So that's why they said, well, I'm going to get out of here. And then Tracy wanted to go back in there because I guess he thought he wasn't going to go back in.
So-
So, and meanwhile, he would have had experience on the line, which I know he said he didn't need the experience on the line, or he had the experience, for 8 or 9 months, which I do believe in.
Okay. But in either event, you wouldn't have expected either of those guys to fulfill 3 years on that job.
They were all in there. Tracy was there 5 years, you know, in that position, 5 going on 6
Right.
years.
But if you go back to the agreement that you've referenced, if there was one that was agreed to and all that stuff, right?
Mhm.
If such an agreement did exist,
Mhm.
it only would have existed, based on my reading, from Assistant Chief Tracy's perspective, if it was going to be short-term and he was going to be circled back to that spot not long thereafter. So that by default would conclude me to say that neither one of those guys, I can't speak for their intentions, but it would appear that neither one had a 3-year shelf life in that spot that they were laterally being moved into.
You mean like Chavanello, 3 years in that position?
Yeah,
Okay, well, that's when that came about with the contract,
yeah.
which they knew that and the union knew that, so they took advantage of that opportunity. On page 57, last paragraph, if all agreed, which that's exactly what happened
Okay.
with
Thank
the
you.
union president and secretary there. Believe me, I wouldn't have even done that if they didn't all come and want to do that.
Okay.
And again, Tracy changed his mind.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I hope I answered that all right.
I'm good on that.
Did you have some follow-up questions, Kristen?
No, No more questions.
Kevin, do you?
Kristen touched on a couple last points I wanted to make. And then I guess if you want to just go through the conclusion quickly to see if it ties into everything we've talked about or learned along the way, I'll defer to you if you want to go first, ma'am.
No,
Or-
go ahead.
Take us through.
The first thing is, we talked about there being no direct benefit. I think you've already answered that question. I had that highlighted back in the front.
I'm
I'm
sorry.
on conclusion,
Page 15.
Oh,
page 15.
yeah. no
I'm just
direct
kinda reading
agreement,
out
right.
loud
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
We talked about the vacancies, we talked about everyone, the end result. Everyone knew what was going on, whether there was anything going on beyond that. The chief did have the right to do it. He did have the power. I'm answering my questions as I go along here because they've been touched upon along the way. Can you just quickly touch on the CBA, where it wasn't followed on that transfer issue, just so I can
Yeah.
have clarity on that?
On the transfer issue, what's been said is that once, if an administrative decision had been made to transfer Chavanello into the position and transfer Tracy out, Curry was the next man in seniority, and the position should have been offered to him first before Chavanello got put in. Curry told me anyway, despite what the chief said in his letter, and I'm sure Mr. Saxel's made that as part of your
Yeah, we've
record,
seen it,
that he told me that his intentions to retire were well-known, and that he was not offered the job before Chavanello was put in the position. If you were going by the seniority list, he was the senior person.
Right, okay, so that's where the CBA wasn't followed. And
Correct.
his comment that I had forgotten about before of his intent to retire further cements my previous comments about why would you put people who are looking to retire in a spot that requires them to be there 3 years?
I think that's
It's a fair
legitimate
question. It's a fair question. Otherwise, I think I'm good. The only other comment I have here is, I have some comments here about the public and private sessions of the fire commission, and I'm not clear what they did out back, out front, or how they did it, or if they did it right or wrong. I'm not judging that. I just don't know enough. And I think, as Mr. Tetral talked about before, I think it's a great idea for all of us to have a clearer, better understanding of that whole process and how it integrates into this contract and these types of matters.
The only thing I can tell you is I went back and looked at the minutes. There's no mention of any of these promotions being made in the minutes. Mr. Saxel, in his defense of the chief, said, made some comment about executive session, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
One would expect, though, if these promotions were approved, that there would be some reference in the official record, and I didn't see it.
And to follow on, Mr. Conrad, to your point, if the questions about the fire commission, their practices, it's, I think, unfair to ask these two gentlemen to address that totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perhaps we can get the chair of the commission to come here and speak to some of us on that, clear in terms of.
I think that's a great idea,
follow
especially
on
with the
that.
changeover and the new faces. So it's a good time to take a fresh look, right?
Or perhaps even simpler, we could join them at one of their meetings and talk about some of the FOI.
I think that's great.
Questions that have come up.
I think that's fantastic.
Central, they don't have meetings, which is only in July and August.
Hmm.
They canceled the summer meetings till
Did they?
September, unless if we have a grievance or if there's a hearing. And do we have a grievance? Yeah, so they'll be meeting. But I want to let you know, they officially, by the minutes, they don't meet until September again, their official meeting.
All right.
Yeah, that certainly is one of the challenges with them in the grievance process and everything in terms of how the contract is written. And certainly that creates complications for them and their scheduling, as well as for timing. And one of the issues, just so you all are clear, is that each of the grievances has certain deadlines, measured in days by when things need to get back and be resolved. So that means we're getting a commission together, finding a date, getting a quorum together,
Yeah.
and somehow making sure they have all the information they need to formulate a decision in that. So it's more complicated than perhaps it needs to be in that regard.
Good. And I did want to thank Mr. Tetral for allowing me the time to go through this document, which I felt was important to me because I didn't have a chance to do it the first time around, and I've had time to read it and absorb it. So I know it was a little painful and tedious going through it page by page, but I found it helpful, and I certainly do appreciate the opportunity to do that with this board. And thanks to the chief for coming out and answering questions, and thanks to Mr. Trembecki for putting together the report and for being here to answer questions. It's much appreciated. It really is.
Thank you, Rob.
Kristen, right ahead.
Just a few kind of thoughts and comments, and I am probably going to repeat a few things that were said just because I think some of them bear repeating. But I want to thank the First Selectman for starting the meeting with acknowledging the death of the 19 firefighters in Arizona. And I also just want to acknowledge the work of every firefighter in this community, because when you go out, you're literally willing to put your lives on the line for all of us in this community and beyond, strangers and friends and neighbors alike. So I have entered into this conversation and will continue to, with the respect for the work that all of you do. We have had this conversation going on for quite some time, back since December and the beginning of this year. And I think just a couple things that I just wanted to touch on before we leave this conversation today is reiterating and being grateful for the Fire Commission's motion about the recommendation and a change in contracts to use an average in salaries, which is one way for us to look at some of the issues. And thanking again the First Selectman, and I expect that the First Selectman and the Chief and our FOI expert, who I see in the back of the room, to help the Commission with understanding their roles and responsibilities. Again, I think as Attorney Trembecki pointed out, with a group of volunteers, it's important that we provide the support and the knowledge that they need, and it's also important for them to be able to fulfill their responsibilities. Again, I think that, as I said before, I am grateful to the chief for all that he's done, but I don't agree with some of the actions taken, and particularly with respect to the lateral transfers. I find those actions in particularly troubling. I am grateful also for this conversation, for the chief's, your willingness to dialogue with us and to dialogue with Attorney Trembecki, and to Attorney Trembecki, to you for your examining this issue, and that it is before this board and that we can have this kind of open dialogue. I think it's really critical. I hope that we can take the lessons from this and move forward and make the course corrections needed so that we don't have to all find ourselves in this position in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. Just,
Okay.
do you have anything more to add?
I did, yeah.
Okay, go right ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on Kristen's comments, which I agree with, and her last comment about the lessons that have been learned here. They are many, and they are very important. There's no question about that. In the end, though, for me, it still kind of circles back to the initial conversation that we had when I put together the initial spreadsheet that showed, not names, but it showed positions in dates of service and dates of change in salaries and how long they moved into a new position and all that stuff. It was a lot of math, but there was a spreadsheet. In the end, there were decisions made here that I agree with Selectman McCarthy's comments, that I certainly disagree with those management decisions that were made. But all of that said, there were decisions that were made that ended up adding a good $2+ million to our pension obligation over the next 25 or 30 years. That is an undeniable fact. I've done the math. The math has been vetted by the CFO. Now, the actuaries will tell you that it will end up being, as a net amount, something less than that, because there will be interest earned along the way to help offset those payments that need to be made. I get all that. So whether it's $800,000 in the end cash out of pocket, or whether it's the high end, the $2 million that it calculates out to as an additional obligation to the pension fund today, it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of taxpayer money, and it's a lot of money that we could be doing something else with as a town, as a society, for our schools, for our kids, for our seniors, for our roads. And I'm still not convinced that, and I'll have to ask Mr. Tetro this question, we've learned a lot, we know a lot now, there's things to do differently going forward, but as far as what has happened, what is the administration's position on corrective action or any actions that you plan to take? Because this has been going on for 6-7 months now. And other than the fire commission meeting making their recommendations, which I think are good, but there's also at least one or two that are pretty benign there. I think they're things they already should have been doing. And other than knowing that we need to look at the agreement differently going forward to carve some of the stuff out, which makes sense, or limit this exposure going forward, all of that makes sense. But from a management perspective, from the CEO perspective, what actions have you taken or do you plan to take as a result of this?
Thank you. From the top, and let's just clarify the numbers, because I think that is important. And this was just communicated out to the board with this packet. So if you'd like further presentation on this at another meeting from our CFO, we'll be happy to give that.
Happy to do it.
But it looks like the actual impact of the increased expenses, as reported in a prior report, were about $883,000. When you net that out against the savings from lower-priced people being on and their projections, that what we come down to is a net to the town of about $197,000, so about $200,000 is the cost of this. Now, I'm going to suggest that that's still a very big number, and I'm going to suggest that we spent a lot of time during the budget process looking for $200,000 and a lot less, and that's a significant amount of money and something that we do not want kind of a repeat of this to the extent that we can. The primary obligation, I think we started with administrative actions with the Fire Commission, and I went to the Fire Commission and sat down and talked and said, we need to stop this right away. So the first thing we did is put some administrative actions in place to stop that, to make sure that we stop the bleeding, if you will, at that time. We do have a promotion list in place, and I think the Fire Commission is aware that, one, that's a contractual obligation, and two, that's one of their management obligations for the town to make sure that is in place so that we follow that. Three, there are a number of I'm going to call them contractual clarifications, but also some changes to the contract in a host of areas that would keep this type of thing from happening in the future. And we are very much working on those. And lastly, I think that because, unlike many of our boards and commissions, the Fire Commission is given a certain amount of management responsibility. And I had started working with Chairman Popolowski on this, but I will pick up the conversations with Chairman Christie in order to make sure that there's improved communication and clarity in terms of what their responsibilities are and how we need to work together to manage the department.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Flynn, may I add to that? Sorry, would you?
Chief, if you have something to add.
Yes, I have something to add. I don't know where they got that ridiculous number of $800 and some thousand, which I'm sure you haven't read this yet, this report
Yeah,
on
Chief,
the audit.
if you're going to stand up there and question the actuarial numbers, I would suggest this is not the time or the place. And if you want the actuaries here to do that, then please do.
Okay, okay. But you
All right,
can't
but
say also in the budget that we saved $183,000 by the retirees and paying new men that went on. None of that seems to be important.
When it's all netted out, Chief, that's where the $200,000 expense comes from.
Okay,
That's why we have actuaries. That's to Chairman Kiley's point. If all you do is look at the numbers, you add $2 million approximately to the cost of the pension. If you don't look at what nets out against that, if you don't look at the present value of those numbers, which is how businesses look at that, then you can, on one hand, err on the high side. On the other hand, you need to look at the total impact and total cost structure, and that's what managers do. And that's
Okay.
we need to
And
keep that in mind in terms of the
that's what I
total
did.
cost.
And if I might, without being rude, and I hope you don't think I'm rude, you'll take an individual on a department who's been paying into the pension for 25 years, beyond the 30 years, that's $1.5 million. So if that individual retired at 30 years, he would have collected $1.5 million. Right now, that money is still in the pension fund, and also Chavanillo, the 40 years on, And I believe, in talking with accountants and so forth and so on, you draw interest on that. So if you look at the overall pension thing, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, but that one individual would have been paid $1.5 million.
Yeah.
That's all in the pension fund,
Chief.
drawing interest from the town.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to hear that.
Chief, thank you. That's why we have, please, Chief, thank you
Thank
for your
you.
comments. That's
You're
why we
welcome.
have actuaries to do those calculations, Chief.
Right.
And we stand by the numbers at 200,000. And if you have another actuary that wants to come in and review those numbers, we're happy to do that.
I think I
But
proved
Chief,
that today.
you're done.
Thank you.
you.
May I?
If it's quick.
Yeah,
Yes, please.
I think, sure, I can acknowledge that that's true. We have, that's part of the confluence of events that Attorney Trembecki talked about, is that we have a whole host of firefighters who have served our town faithfully for many, many years, and who have served beyond the eligible age of retirement. And in fact, that statement can be made. But that doesn't change, for me, the fact that there was a process that I disagree with, that whether the number is 2 million, 200,000, or even $20, I just want to be clear. I appreciate that Selectman Kiley brought up the numbers, and I further appreciate the first Selectman clarifying that we have to look at the big picture, but we also have to look at our process. And that, I just wanted to follow up that. I will acknowledge that's very true. There are many firefighters who, and other town employees, who have done the same. So, thank you, First Selectman.
All right, thank you. Any further comments from the board?
No, thank you.
All right. I guess as I look at this, you know, one of the challenges or concerns for me in all of this is we've got some tremendously hardworking firefighters. The chief has done a tremendous job for a number of years. We've got 2 storms, Sandy and Nemo, that we expected and got phenomenal service from and effort from on firefighters and those involved. Excuse me if I could, while I'm talking, please.
Okay, just acknowledge something. I apologize, Mr.
Thank you.
Selectman.
Thank you. However, it does leave a bad taste in everybody's mouth. It does leave a bad taste in the town to have these firefighters, to some degree, looked askew because they took, because of the clauses in the contract and how this was played out. I think this is not the greatest episode for the fire department, the fire commission, or our town in terms of what this does in this economy when people are struggling to keep a job, to get a job, to keep their salaries, to see this type of thing take place. And I think that we have to make every effort to work together and make the changes we need to keep this type of thing, because whether it's legal or not, whether it's within the contract or not, frankly, it just looks lousy. And there's nobody who's looked at this from the outside who says, wow, that's the way to run a great department, that's the way to run a great town, that's the way to take care of your people. And I think that our residents are duly upset through that process. It certainly is not something that the taxpayers of this town look forward to funding. And the problem is, the firefighters have done a stellar job for decades in this town and have easily one of the best reputations of any fire department in the state. And I think this just creates an image that is not consistent with that, and it's unfortunate in all regards. So I think we want to make every effort and take every step to make sure anything like this doesn't happen in the future. So with that, Attorney Trembecki, thank you very much for your hard work on this and coming together and putting that in.
Thank you.
Appreciate
All
it.
right.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Next up, it says tax collector. I hear there are no tax refunds at this time.
I don't know. I didn't see-
There.
Do we have a stack?
There are no tax refunds today.
All right, so we'll take no action on that.
Beautiful.
We move on to hear and act on any other communications, to hear, consider, and act upon any other business which should properly come before this town. Before we adjourn, I have 2 announcements. One, we have sidewalk sale days on July 27th here in town. That will be a Saturday, and I would encourage everybody to attend. We also have a public hearing on the Aquarian 20% rate increase, July 9th at 6:30 at Fairfield Ward High School. And I would strongly encourage everybody to attend. This is a public hearing before PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Agency, and they need to hear from us that this is not acceptable and that we need to hold Aquarian accountable for their actions. With that, May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.